Hi, in this demonstration, we will look at the analysis of another Office document containing the malicious macro code. In the previous two demonstrations, I showed you how to debug the macro code within the original malicious document. In case if you have not viewed those two video demonstrations, I encourage you to view those two video demonstrations because there were some concepts that were covered which I'm not going to cover again. So this is the document that I'm going to debug. So let me open this document, and you see that there is a macro that is present in this document, and it is prompting me to click on enable content. Okay, so let's bring up the Visual Basic editor and see see the macro code. So this document contains the macro code, and if you watched my previous video, I told you the best place to start is to start with the auto executable functions, right? So because these are some of the auto executable functions. The reason why this is the best place to start is because whenever document is opened, this is the first function that will be executed. By setting a breakpoint, we will be able to break at the start of the code. So now we see the auto executable function here. So the best place would be to set a breakpoint here. But if you watched my previous videos, I also showed you that it's not easy to debug the macro code within the original document. There are some problems. So to overcome that problem, we came up with a workaround. So where we triggered an error, right? So I'm going to follow the same procedure here. I'm going to add a statement like hello, which cannot be recognized by the Visual Basic script, and then I will save this, and then what I'll do is I'll reopen this document, and once I reopen the document, it is asking me to enable the content. I enable the content. So once I enable the content, you see that it triggered an error at this statement because it could not recognize this statement. But the reason for triggering this error is because when I click on OK, it automatically sets a breakpoint at this function. So now I can remove this statement and start debugging the macro code. So this is the reason why we added that statement. Now let's see what this macro code does. You see that the macro code creates a shell object which is stored in this variable here, and then it uses this shell object and expands this environment string here, right, and stores it in this variable. Now I also discussed in my previous video that the best way to examine the variable, so by examining this variable, we'll get an idea what's inside this variable, right? So the best method to examine the contents of the variable is by bringing up the locals window. So that's what I'll do. So which will display all the local variables associated with the function. Now you see that I'll set a breakpoint here and run till this point. Okay. So, and then you see the path variable is now empty, right? Now after I single step, I'm going to press F8, which is for single stepping, and I press F8, you see that the path variable contains this value. So it expanded that environment variable. It now contains C users, administrator, app data, roaming, right? So now it expanded the string. Next, what it is doing is it is concatenating this path with this executable file, right? So tm4p.exe. So let me go to that roaming directory here. There is no file. You see that I'm in the roaming directory and there is no file with that name. After I execute this code, you will see that a 0 KB file was created, right? Then let's see what it does. Then it opens a handle to the file. Basically, it opens a file temp.exe, which doesn't exist at this point. In fact, it created tm4p.exe, not the temp.exe. In this case, it opens a handle to that file, right? So which creates this tmp.exe file, right? And then what it is, this is interesting. You see that it is going to do a base 64 decode, and the content that it's going to decode is coming from this userform 1.textbox1. So if you go to forms, you see there is userform 1, and then there is text box 1. Inside the text box there is a content which looks like it is a base64 encoded content. So basically what it's doing is it is taking that content and passing it to base64 decode function, and it will decode the content and store in the variable DLL. So instead of stepping into the function, I'll step over this function by pressing shift F8, and then you will see that now the DLL variable contains the MZ header. So it looks like it decoded the executable from the user form and from the text box that is within the user form, right? And then it's going to write that decoded content, which is the executable content, into this variable DLL with into this file that is this which is a file object that it created. So basically it's going to write to the temp.exe, the decoded executable content. So you see that before I execute this file, temp.exe is still 0 KB. After I execute, you will see that it has a 173 KB content. So which means malware actually decoded the base64 encoded content by reading this user form and by reading the text box inside that user form, and then it decoded the base64 content and it got the executable content and it wrote that executable to this file. So now we know the functionality of this macro code. Now we know that this macro code is a dropper, so which actually decodes the content on the fly and drops the file onto the disk. And then now what it's going to do is it's going to run that executable file. But before I run the executable file, what I will do is I'm going to run the packet capture on the Linux machine. Okay, so that if there is any network activity, I'll be able to see that here. And also in my previous video, I showed you that the gateway for this Windows machine is set to this IP address, that is 192.168.1.22, which is the IP address of this Linux machine. And also on this Linux machine, I'm simulating all the services like the DNS and HTTPS using inetsim. So the idea is that when malware makes any network connection or request for any resource, we can give a fake response to the malware. All right. So now I'm going to run this code. Let's see what happens. You see that after I run the code, so you see that there was a communication, there was a request, there was a attempt to resolve this domain anin-gutterbud.com, and it resolved to this IP address because we simulated the DNS service, and then it made an HTTP connection to that particular domain, and this is the content that it passed, and this is the HTTP content. You can see that it made a connection, it made a post request, and it is sending some encrypted data on the network. So now we know that malware, the macro code drops an executable file and executes that executable file, which connects to this domain and sends some data. Now this, we have enough indicators that you can create on your security device to detect this infection. Okay, so with the and before that, also another thing that I wanted to show is, now we were debugging the macro code within the original document. So because of which this user form 1 and the text box, the content from the text box 1 was available to the malware. Now let's see if the tools can extract this content. What will happen if, because this can bypass some of the tools, this technique can bypass some of the tools. Let me show you that. So I'm going to copy this document statement.doc into the OLE tools folder, and I'm going to extract the macro using the OLE VBA. We saw this how to extract the macro in the first demo. I'm going to use the same method here, and I'm going to extract the macro, and I'll call it statement.text. I'm going to redirect the content. Let's open this and see what happens. You see that this is the macro code, right? I can change the language to Visual Basic. right? So you see that this is the content of this document. You see this is the exact same content that we saw. As you can see here, it is reading the userform.textbox1. It was able to extract. Also, it was able to extract the code of the user form, but also notice how the tool was not able to extract the base64 content which was embedded inside the text box 1. Now, what happens is if you copy this code into a if you open a new document and bring up the Visual Basic editor and copy this code and start running, and it will trigger an error at this point because it cannot find the userform.textbox1 because the tool was not able to extract it, which is supposed to be a base64 encoded content. At this point, you will get an error and you will not be able to determine the actual behavior of the malware. So this is the reason I wanted to show this malware sample, is because this sample can bypass tools like this if it fails to extract the actual content. So another method of analyzing is basically define this variable saying that userform.textbox1 is equal to that base64 content, and then decode and then debug this macro. But again, to overcome that problem, the best method is to debug the macro within the actual document. That way, the macro code will have everything that it needs. Okay, so with this, I complete the analysis of this document. In the next demonstration, I'll show you another document which uses a simple trick to bypass the sandbox analysis. Thank you for watching, and I hope you will watch the next video. Thank you.